as you can see from the thing, my name is Martin Connell. Well, actually, my mother calls me Martin. Everyone else calls me Marty Connell. So I've been with the business about 26 plus years. To my left, as we look at the screen, is Danielle Nielsen, who's our marketing manager and has helped to really pull this together. And of course, Holly Mills, who's one of our shining lights, one of our newer shining lights at Hygain Mitavite. And part of a terrific nutritional team. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But Holly, along with Alicia Takanaga, who's also another one of our new people, and Annette Ward as well. So we've got that terrific trifecta and trio there of people who are our nutritional advisors on the spot. So anytime you've got questions relating to your horses, these are the people that you're going to be able to speak to, as well, of course, as the plethora of territory managers, many of whom are joining us. So I just want to, welcome you all aboard here today or tonight. Hopefully there's a few little tidbits. It's a really difficult area, laminitis and founder. And to be honest, the greatest experts in the world, and that's certainly not us, but the greatest experts in the world would themselves admit that there's a long way to go in terms of understanding so many aspects of this ailment. And yet it's such a traumatic ailment. I know many of you here have probably experienced having horses, or may even currently be experiencing horses with laminitis. And as we know, it can even lead to their ultimate demise. So it's a pretty disturbing area, and yet yet one which has been the subject of so much research, but still so much to learn. And eventually we will learn more and more about it and get more solutions. Tonight, what we're going to do is go through some aspects, some of the anatomy and some of the potential contributing factors to that. And then we're also going to go through some possible nutritional strategies in dealing with it. To say, if we had a silver bullet, we'd have one slide on that and say, bang, we fixed it. Unfortunately, we don't, but hopefully can pick up some tidbits. So I welcome everyone aboard here tonight. I'm sure we've got people from all walks of the equine area. We've got some of our own people, and I'm sure we've got some people from some of our opposition as well. We welcome you aboard as well, because it's got to be a communal gathering, if you like, to try and help fix this ailment. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to Holly to take us through some things, and I shall be back shortly to go through some other nutritional elements. So Holly, over to you.
All right, thanks everyone for coming. I'm going to share my screen, and as we go along, feel free to pop questions in the chat, and we will try to answer them at the end, as many as we can. All right, so hopefully, can everyone see this? All right, so, ooh, I'm stuck at the wrong spot. Okay, now we're at the start. So we're gonna go through laminitis. I'm gonna start us off tonight. So first thing I wanted to touch on before we actually go into managing is just a bit of anatomy of the horse's hoof, and that will give us a bit of an understanding of what laminitis actually is. So the bones of the hoof are actually suspended within the horse's leg. All right, so they're not actually on the ground, they're suspended up in there, and they're attached to the horse's hoof wall by collagen fibers that stick out from the bone and the hoof wall to connect them together. And in my mind, I guess I imagine them like Velcro, sticking the hoof wall and the bone together and suspending it there in that foot. So you can see that here, that Velcro structure here is that red. And on the left here, we've got a lovely healthy hoof. And then on the right, obviously, it's looking very worse for wear, and that's our laminitic hoof. So these collagen fibers are called laminae. So that's where we get the name laminitis from. So laminitis or founder actually means the inflammation of that laminae. So when that red structure, that Velcro, becomes inflamed, that's laminitis, and that inflammation can weaken the laminae, and it can actually start to separate from the horse's hoof wall. So as you can imagine, it's a really painful experience. It's almost like tearing your fingernails away from your fingers, but it's their feet. They rely on their feet. They need their feet for life, to get them around. Like the saying goes, no hoof, no horse, right? So this here down the bottom, you can see that's where that separation has started to happen, and the hoofs actually started to rotate. So there's a few structures that really keep the whole anatomy of the leg in place. And you can see at the back there, there's a blue, this is a tendon. And that tendon, when the laminae weakens, the tendon puts force on the bone and actually will cause that rotation there. So, and the bone can actually protrude through the bottom of the foot. So very painful experience for that horse. So that's the failure of the laminae. So just at a very basic level, that's what laminitis actually is. So inflammation of that Velcro, failure of the structure, separation, and potentially that rotation and protrusion. Hopefully not though. So then now we kind of know what laminitis is, we want to know some common signs to look out for. So one really classic sign is that leaning back to relieve pressure. So this is generally what most people will think of when they think of a laminitic horse, is that leaning back. So laminitis can occur in all 4 feet, but most commonly it happens in the front. So that horse there is literally just trying to take the pressure off its front feet to relieve that pain. Another common sign that people will test for is sole sensitivity. So this person down the bottom is using a hoof tester. It's important to remember that these aren't exactly specific signs. So sole sensitivity, it could be an abscess, but it's putting a few bits and pieces together that makes you wonder, or just to be aware of, maybe this is laminitis. Is that something that I should consider? So another one is reluctance to move forward. Again, quite a non-specific sign. It's really just a sign of pain. So that could be muscular or a tendon sort of injury as well, but it can also be a sign of laminitis. And then another classic one, the warm hooves. So heat in general means inflammation. So the blood's going there to try to send lots of healing goodness down there. And as we talked about before, laminitis is a disease of inflammation. So the feet will get hot because of that inflammation. And then you might be able to feel that bounding digital pulse as well. So potentially if you might see all of these signs, or you might only see one of them, but they might make you think, oh, does my horse could have laminitis potentially? Good things to be aware of, and sort of things to look out for. So I want to touch on 2 main nutritional reasons why laminitis can occur. So these are 2 ways that we can experimentally induce laminitis. It's again important to note that Martin already touched on it. We don't know everything about laminitis. I hope one day we will, but I think we're really far away from that. The truth is it's a very complex disease, and it's a multifactorial disease, which means there's many factors that come together to eventuate to laminitis. So, but 2 things that we know will cause laminitis if we give it to a horse experimentally, and one of those is carbohydrate overload. So generally we'll see that because of pasture, but it can be because of grain as well. So what happens is if there's lots of lush green pasture out in the paddock and your horse has access to a lot of that, or if your horse breaks into the feed room and eats through an entire bag of feed, less common but can happen, is your horse ends up eating too many carbohydrates for what its digestive system can naturally handle. The horse's digestive system isn't designed to eat a lot of sugar. So some of those carbohydrates, in pasture, it'll be fructan, and in grains, it's generally starch. So those carbohydrates will pass into the hindgut where they're not supposed to be, and they will rapidly ferment in there. And that rapid fermentation produces lactic acid and some gas as well. So you might see that maybe your horse gets a bit of gas colic, and that rapid fermentation produces lactic acid, which actually causes a drop in pH. And when pH decreases, so there's a whole life full of bugs in your horse's hindgut, and that life lives in a really tricky balance. And pH is one thing in particular that can really upset that balance. So a decrease in pH can cause some of that good bacteria that we want in there that's really beneficial to the horse to actually die. And that death will break open the cell and release a toxin called LPS, or lipopolysaccharide. And that LPS can then enter through the digestive system and into the bloodstream. And that's when we get endotoxemia or sepsis. And then if we look up here, we can say, so we've got carbohydrate overload, hindgut acidity, endotoxemia, which just means those toxins going into the blood, which means sepsis. And then there's a few dots. We're not exactly sure what happens in the middle there, but we know if we overload a horse with carbohydrates, it will end up in laminitis. So you might see diarrhea, which just gives an indication that the horse's hindgut isn't happy. The microbes are not having a good time in there. So that's number one thing that we want to consider with our horses. You know, if you're worried about laminitis, or if you're looking to avoid, ask yourself, you know, does my horse have access to a lot of lush green pasture, or did they break into the feed room? So that's number one, carbohydrates. And then number 2 is EMS, insulin obesity, or hormonal induced laminitis. So generally we'll see this being triggered by supplemental feed, like a grain feed, or a bagged feed, or even hay. It could be pasture as well, but generally it's those supplemental feeds that is triggering this kind of laminitis. And this is probably one of the more common. The hormonal laminitis is probably more common. So what happens in this instance is, so insulin is a hormone. So we know that experimentally, if we give a horse a really high amount of insulin, which creates high insulin in the blood, or hyperinsulinemia, we know that eventually that will lead to laminitis within realistically a couple of hours or a day. So how does a horse end up with high insulin in their blood? So this happens with diabetes as well, if anyone's familiar with diabetes. So when you eat sugar, your body will naturally release insulin to tell your cells there's sugar, take it up. And your cells need that sugar for life. To function. But if there's lots of sugar always in the blood, your body can become resistant to the insulin. So they need to release more insulin for your cells to listen. And that means you'll end up with too much insulin in the blood, which can trigger laminitis. So this is what happens with EMS horses, or equine metabolic syndrome, and insulin resistance, or obesity. It's also what tends to happen with Cushing's horses as well. So it's definitely something that we need to be aware of. We want to try to improve insulin responses here. So obviously, if we're looking at this being caused by obesity, we want to make sure that we're exercising our horses appropriately and keeping our horses in a nice, healthy weight. And we want to remember that laminitis is a disease and not something that we ever want to happen to our horses. So although fat and shiny might be the want of some people, we really want our horses to actually be healthy and maintaining a really healthy weight to prevent any kinds of diseases that are associated with being overweight. So in this case, when we're trying to monitor our insulin response to feed, we want to look at our NSC, our sugar content, because obviously the more sugar in the feed, the more insulin our body is going to have to release to tell the cells to take it up. So those are the two types. Remember, we're talking about carbohydrates overload, too many sugars ending up in the back, and then hormonal, so insulin, too many sugars, simple sugars. All right, so I'm just going to give you a bit of a carbohydrate glossary. So for anyone that has experienced laminitis or is looking into maybe a high fiber diet, you might have seen some letters on the back of your feed bag. So that will be, or starch, all right? So somehow you might be looking for a low starch feed. You've Googled laminitis and it says feed low starch. What does that mean? So starch is a carbohydrate that contains multiple glucose units. So it just means one big molecule full of sugar, okay? So it's designed to be digested in the front end of the horse. Great for providing energy, but if we've got a laminitis prone horse, it's something that we would stay away from. So that could be found in things like grains, like barley, corn, oats, etc. So then one of the other things you might see on the back of the bag might say WSC, and you might think, what is that? So this stands for water-soluble carbohydrates, and this includes fructan and simple sugars such as sucrose and glucose, okay? So I guess starch is more of a complex molecule that requires a bit more to break it down, whereas water-soluble carbohydrates, we're getting into the more of those sort of simpler sugars, plus fructan, which is what we would generally see in a pasture, high sugar pastures. Generally it's fructan in there. So another set of letters you might see is ESC. So this is ethanol-soluble carbohydrates. And this is an indication of the water-soluble carbohydrates minus the fructan. So this is going to tell you your simple sugars. So if you had a horse with hormonal problems or EMS, we want to stay with a low ESC because that's going to give you a lower insulin response. And then fructan by itself, like I said before, this is a bigger molecule that contains multiple fructose, generally what you would see in pasture. So a C3 pasture, which is a cooler season pasture, accumulates fructan as their carbohydrate reserve. That's generally because cooler season pastures are a bit more hearty, so they can survive that cooler temperature. They need more of a hearty carbohydrate reserve. So down here in Vic, that's where you'll generally see those cooler season pastures. And then warmer season pastures generally have a lower NSC content. So something like a Rhodes grass. So if you've ever heard, if you've got a horse with laminitis, they might have said, feed a Rhodes grass hay. That's because it's a different type of grass that generally has a lower sugar content. And then if we bring them all together, if we want an overall value, that's called our NSC. So NSC is a combination of all of those things: total sugar, starch component, tells you everything. So potentially if you have a laminitis or a laminitic prone horse, you might want to look for a low NSC diet. So that's just a bit of background, and hopefully that will help you when you're looking at your next feed bag and with Martin's next bit of the presentation, because we're going to go into some nutritional management, and I'm going to hand over to Marty for that. So let me just move us on over. Remember, if you have any questions as we're going along, to pop them in the chat. So Marty, I think I've just made you host.
You have indeed, Holly. Thank you very much for that. That was fantastic.
No worries.
Great work. So I will, hopefully this will come in nice and quick. All right. I'm tipping everyone. Oh, that's the one you just did, wasn't it? I want to go over the same thing. All righty, let's talk a little bit about nutritional management of the laminitic horse. So again, thanks very much for that, Holly. That's fantastic. As you can see, you can give Holly a call at any stage or get in touch with her. There's not a whole lot that she can't answer. So fantastic work. Let's talk a wee bit about nutritional management of the horse, and let's talk about the pasture first, because as we know, particularly this time of the year, pasture is likely to be our biggest issue. Let's be brutally honest, we can come up with all sorts of treatments, we can come up with these great feeds and all of those sorts of things, but if you've still got the horse on the thing that's causing it, you're going to have a few problems. Okay. Now, at various times of the year, including right now, the pasture can be particularly high in sugar. I apologise if you can currently hear my toy poodles barking. I will deal with them later, the little buggers. They just, anytime someone comes to the front door, off they go. So at various times of the year, the pasture can be particularly high in sugar. And that's particularly because of the temperature. As Holly alluded to before, with these C3 grasses that we see in the southern regions, then you think of your things like your clover, ryegrasses, all of these sorts of things. Their temperature range, 10 to about 25 degrees Celsius is when they're at their peak. And so that's why it's such a problematic time. So how do we manage the pasture? Well, one aspect is to remove the horse. If we can do that, if it is causing our horse to potentially go to that stage of laminitis, then we absolutely want to do what we can. And if that means removing it, sometimes that's what we're going to have to do. But that's not always a viable thing, as we know. We can look at restricting the access. Now, the problem with this is, as we know, some of these horses are clever little buggers, particularly the ponies. They will learn that you're going to lock them up for a certain period of time, and they will graze and they will eat, 24 hours worth of pasture in 5 or 6 hours. And so there is a limit to what we can do. There's no point in just putting it out in an afternoon and say, well, you've only got 4 hours. Trust me, they will go to town on that pasture and cause them even bigger issues. Another thing is strip grazing, which is also a good management practice if you've got limited pasture as well. But some of the benefits, we'll go over some of the benefits of doing things like that. But of course, that also means that the grass is allowed to grow a little bit higher that you're about to go onto as you move the fence line back. And of course, that protects it, as we'll talk a little bit about photosynthesis. The other thing, of course, is a muzzle. Now, some people and some horses hate them, and some horses will eat them, so they can get to the pasture quicker. So having a correctly fitted muzzle is obviously an appropriate way, but I guess it gives us that benefit of having the horse out there at certain times of the day. It allows that interaction with its mates, as well as going out and doing that exercise. As we know, it's not all, we can talk and say, well, just take it off the pasture. Sometimes the spare bedroom's been taken up by someone else. You can't just put the horse there. There's not a whole lot of places to put them. So sometimes we've got to do things of that nature. Removing access at certain times. We're just going to go over that for shortly. So the time that the horse is allowed to graze becomes vitally important. And in working out that time, we need to understand the actual processes of the pasture growth. So let's look at a few important notes in regards to the pasture. Now, sugar and starches are formed in the pasture via photosynthesis. More starches in your C4 grasses. So when we're talking about those roads, etc., in the warmer climates, they tend to sort of store sugar as starches, and down here there'll be more fructans. But the photosynthesis, and of course photosynthesis requires sunlight. It's a simple concept. So the more the sun, the more the photosynthesis, and guess what? The more the sugar. And that's why, of course, as we get to these longer days in spring, and I know from my solar power that it's performing exceptionally well at the moment, we're getting plenty of sunlight, and that's producing more photosynthesis, more sugar. Now, that's why one of the little hints, there's a lovely little photo of the Florida Horse Park one beautiful morning. See the Spanish moss hanging down there? Brilliant stuff it is. Beautiful place if you ever get to go. Up in Ocala. Now, shaded areas are superb because, of course, when the pasture is shaded, it can still be growing, but the sun isn't having quite the level of impact. And so a shaded area, even if you can create a paddock next to a big old shed that's going to create more shade, you're going to have less photosynthesis taking place. You're going to have less sugar produced. So that's another little hint. Plant yourself a nice big tree. That's why horses, if they were able to graze more in a forest, it's less likely that they're going to founder. It's out in these open plains, these open fields, that we make these magnificent things that we have a few issues. And as we said, now this is a really important point. The introduced C3 pastures contain these fructans. And as I say, your clovers, your ryegrass, these sorts of things. A lot of these pastures were introduced to improve food production. But they have evolved from parts of the world where they had to be hardy because of they were trampled by herds. And yet actually the local C3 grasses, we think of things like wallaby grass, they're not quite as hardy, but they don't contain the fructans. It's a fascinating little thing. So not all C3 contain them, but it's very hard to maintain a full-on native pasture. But if you can, with something like wallaby grass, you're not going to have as many of those issues. C4 grasses, of course, they will lock it up as starches, and that's why things like Rhodes, etc., tend to be less so. One of the countries that I do a fair bit of work in when I was allowed to travel was New Caledonia. New Caledonia, it's amazing. They've got their pasture is generally pretty poor. Again, it's introduced for cattle, etc. So there's a lot of oxalates that you've got to be careful with. But their hay is appalling. And when I say appalling, we'd look at it and go, I'm not feeding that to my horse. No chance. It's all Rhodes and C4s. You know, I have almost never seen a horse founder there, even when they throw grain at it, because they're not dealing in pastures which are high in fructans or sugars. And even the hay they give them is so damn awful in many respects, but so low in sugar that they just don't founder. So that's the concept of sometimes we kill them with kindness. We look for a beautiful hay that's got that beautiful aroma to it, and it's also pretty sweet. Now, here's an important point about what time of the day you can have a horse grazing. Now, our most the safest time is generally, because I should explain this. The concept is, as we know, with the photosynthesis process, the sugar builds up during the day. Okay, so afternoon, you definitely don't want the horse out there. Now, after the sun goes down, the grass then uses the sugar to respirate and continue growing. Now, eventually that sugar will run out because the photosynthesis has stopped. Old mate, the sun's gone, moon's come up. The grass said, yeah, no, not dealing with you. So there's no photosynthesis taking place. Okay, now by midnight, 1 o'clock in the morning, 2 o'clock in the morning, depending on the circumstances, the sugar is gone or largely disappeared. And so first thing in the morning, it's a lot safer until the sun starts to really kick in again around about 10 in the morning or so, and we want to bring that horse back in. But the exception to that is that once the grass goes underneath 5 degrees Celsius, respiration stops. It begins protecting itself. It says, oh, I'm a bit chilly. I'm not going to continue to grow. I'm going to lock these sugars up. Now, you go and put your horse out after a frosty night like that, and you might as well have chucked a whole bunch of cherry ripes across the pasture, because it will be full of sugar. So please, first thing in the morning is good in most cases, but you've got to watch that there's not that frost. And that's why spring can be so dynamite at times, because we still get those cold nights. Okay, of course, hay can actually be another big enemy of ours. Hay we will use as a pasture substitute, but if we use the same grass, particularly in spring, if we've cut some grass hay, a nice rye clover, it's going to be potentially as high as 25% sugar. So you've got to be really careful about that. You can see a little bit of a graph here where cereal hays particularly, which again, a cool season, your cereal hays can be as high as 30% sugar. You can get some oaten hay that can barely go through a chaff mill because it's so high in sugar. So you've got to be really cautious with those. Your grass hays can vary enormously. It'd be great if you can actually get a list, and some places will produce some low sugar grass hay, and that's fantastic. We've got to check that out. Lucerne hay is generally a lot lower. It's generally around about that 10%. But as you can see there, so you've got your higher sugar hays, oat and wheat and barley, etc. your lowers, and you can see again some T4 coming in there with the roads. Lucerne as well. Now, I do stress Lucerne's a wee bit controversial at times. Some people say, oh, you definitely can't give it to a horse prone to laminitis. Well, that's not necessarily the case, but we do have to exercise caution. But like any hay, we can try and take a little bit more care by soaking it. Don't need to soak it overnight. Soak it for about an hour, and you'll take about 40 to 50% of those WSCs out. The other thing you can do with Lucerne, if you are worried, if you do want to use it, get a bit aggressive with the biscuit of hay. Grab it and belt the crapper out of it, and you can actually get rid of some of the leaves and be left more with the stalk. And the stalk itself is going to be a lot better for them. So if you wanted to use that, but some horses are obviously going to react to it. Some horses are going to condition up too well on it. So you've just got to be cautious. The other thing, of course, we use from a fibre point of view now is super fibres. And these include things like beet pulp, soy hulls, and lupin hulls. And these have a similar energy content almost to oats, but without the sugar and starch content. So they're generally fairly safe. And we've got things like beet, which, as you know, so sugar beet isn't really grown here in this country. So we have to import beet pulp. And then this particular product, the microbeet's processed here. And then there's another product, speedy beet, as you'd be familiar with. So those are very similar sorts of product. One's processed in the UK, one's processed here. But this is a method by which you can provide fibres to horses. Lupin hulls as well. How good are lupins? And we'll talk a wee bit more about them, but lupins are a fantastic grain, and the lupin hulls themselves are really high in fibre, insoluble fibres, and low in starch. So that's another way that we can provide some nutrition to the horse relatively safely. Of course, what we do want to prevent is the grains. As Holly touched on, particularly horses that are susceptible. And I should stress that. I mean, not every horse is going to founder. There are some ponies even that we could force feed an enormous amount of corn to, and they're not going to founder. There's been some terrific research done. When they are prone to it, though, we've got to be very cautious, and that's why we always err on the side of caution. And you can see the non-structural carbohydrate levels here of things like corn. And that's pure starch, about 77% starch. Barley, oats, they provide power, they provide speed, they are something you want to avoid with a horse prone to founder. And then, of course, we start to come down to soybean meal and lupins. How good are lupins? The Australian sweet lupin, I should stress. So that's the specific type, the Lupinus angustifolius, as I believe it's known as, or the blue lupin. Fantastic. About 1% starch, but high in protein, about 33% protein, and reasonably high in fat, about 5% fat. So it can be a good part of an overall diet. Here's a bit of an example of a range of commercial feeds and the NSC levels. Now, you might be looking at that and going, oh my God, how bad is that Track Talk and Release? Track Talk and Release are our products, but they're designed for racing. Please do not give them to your foundering pony. It is not a good idea. Okay, they are designed to have plenty of power because it's being used. They're using this up, and we need that power to perform. Then we start to move downwards through a range of pellets and other grains that start to be a lot lower. But you do need to be cautious. Let me stress this. Please check if you're uncertain. Because a lot of these don't actually declare it. And even some of ours, I mean, we don't declare 36% starch in our Track Talk because we assume that people are going to use some common sense and don't give it to their pony. And so if you are in doubt, you always check that. But you can see coming down all the way through Munga. It's a fascinating little one there. The Munga is a textured feed or a muesli, but very low starch, only 6% starch. One of my personal favourites, that particular product. And then we come down right the way down to, and you'll see there's one of our opposition products there, Prides. They've done a great job there with the Easy Sport, around about 1.1% starch. And then the zero, I just stress something on that. When we say less than 1.5%, it's never actually tested at 1.5. It's all, I think it last tested at 0.9 or something like that, or 0.9. But we like to just err on the side of caution because we're dealing with horses that are very sensitive. So we want to have the worst case scenario that we put there. But as you can see, you've got a total NSC of 5.5%. So what do we look for? Well, when you are looking in the feed store, as I said, take a look at the NSC levels. Also look at the fiber content. It's a really good way of telling. Fiber is the #1 source for horses. That's how they evolved. And so it's really important that we keep that fiber content. Every feed should be at least 9% fiber. They're kidding themselves. If they're not above 9% fiber, it's just not right. Even our racing feeds are about 9 or 10% fiber. And then the higher you go up in fiber, the lower we're going to be in starches and sugars. So look for those at 20% plus when you've got a horse susceptible to that. When you have got a high risk horse as well, let's look for a starch level under 10%. That's definitely going to be your safest way. And a total NSC under 15%, that's what you should be aiming for if you're wanting to feed a hard feed. Now, I stressed that if you want to feed a hard feed, which we'll talk about in a sec. Now, one of the other things we do stress, please don't starve the horse. And I know that sounds like common sense. I tell you, people do it. They look at their horse and they go, oh my gosh, you are such a fatty pumba, you're about to founder, all of these things, and they stop feeding it altogether. It is vital that their digestive system continues to have something going through it. It's just that you need to make it sensible. If your kid's overweight, you don't starve them for 4 days. You just make sure that you feed them in a more healthy way. Okay, you don't take them to Macca's each day. The same thing goes with the horse. Let's have a management program, which is a lot healthier. So as you can see, we generally look about 1.5% of their body weight. Using slow feeders is a great idea. There is some fantastic slow feeding options out there. There's one there, Porter Grazer. Love it. I've got a lot of people who will use those sorts of products, and it stops the horse from bolting the hay, etc., and allows them to graze more effectively, and it stops them having a big GI response, a big glycemic index response. So the more they can graze over the whole day, the better. The other key is don't let them go down as far as their vitamins and minerals. These horses, in many cases, are suffering an ailment. We need to make sure that they're being taken care of. We need to boost their micronutrients, their antioxidant levels, particularly boost their antioxidant levels, your vitamin E, seleniums, your copper, zincs, all of these sorts of things. So how do we do this? First of all, we need to categorize our horses. An average or poor doer, these are the horses that might need 2 kilos or more per day. Now, that might sound strange at this time of year or when we're talking about laminitic horses, but the reality is that some laminitic horses are still underweight, and they can be tough to work with because we've got to find ways of keeping the calories on and the nutrition up to them without pushing them over the edge. So in these sorts of cases, we'd use a complete low NSC feed. I'm going to use 0 as an example. Then add things like oil. Oil's fantastic. There's no sugar or starch in oil. So it's a great way of maintaining some condition. Copra meal. Fantastic little product. It's a great way of having some protein again, and some MCT, some oils in there as well, and then adding a soluble fiber source, be it something like microbeat or something of that nature. You can even possibly finish off with a top dressing like Munga. Say it's because, again, you look and you make sure it's low in starch, and then you can feed some small amounts just to finish them off and maintain a healthy condition. Now, the other type, of course, is your good doer or your easy keeper. Okay, I'm tipping that a few of you have got one of these out there. We've already had some people say that they've got some land whales, etc. So how do we do it with them? Well, we don't really want to go with a complete feed in these sorts of cases. So go with something like a low starch concentrate. I'll use, again, something like balanced, but some horses don't even need that. I've had plenty of cases with customers, and I've just said, hey, don't feed them our stuff. Don't feed them our bags of feed. The horse doesn't need it, but it does need its nutrition. It still needs its micronutrients. And that's where we've actually brought out, we'll touch on it in a second, but we've got a product there called All Care, which we brought out recently, that we threw all the bells and whistles at because we wanted something that you can feed to your ponies, or that you can, your overweight horses that you still need to get nutrition in, something like an All Care, or it's up to you. We haven't got the monopoly on good nutrition. this is presented for you definitely, but you should be able to sort that out yourself. If you found a good multivitamin trace mineral, great, but just make sure that whatever you do use is meeting those needs. And ensure that fiber management's appropriate. Again, I go back to that. No point in taking all of these things and saying, well, I'm going to stop. I'm going to give it a really nice low starch feed and then go and put it in a pasture with an oat and hay roll. Well, that's a bit daft. Okay, so it's so important that we maintain that right pasture management, but also the hay management and general fiber management is right. Okay, so we've actually got a wee bit of an Oprah Winfrey going on as well. We like to do that at these sorts of things. Normally we do these things live. So you might even be looking under your chair if you were at our thing, but unfortunately we're not. So we're just going to tell you up front that we have got a little bit of an offer here, that a 20% off, which you'll be able to access through your contact with us there. And as I say, this particular product is something that we came up with. We put our heads together and said, let's just whack everything in it. So it's the first of these sorts of supplements which provides all of the various, high in vitamin E, selenium, copper, zinc, manganese, etc., but it also has the bona fide, which is something for another session, the quinquinone, which is great for bone density, as well as a mycotoxin binder, prebiotics and probiotics, not so very high in biotin as well, just to help with that repair of the hoof wall as well if we've got some damage. So just watch out. You will get an email regarding that offer, but if you've got other questions about that, you can certainly throw them through to Holly or any of your territory managers as well. So at that, we will go through a few of the questions. Danielle will read us out a few questions. We'll see what we can answer. Those that we can't, that gives us something to study. But we will certainly endeavour to do so. So Danielle, what have we got?
Yes, we've got a few questions here. So Karen's asking, is the information that you're presenting on laminitis the same for donkeys as it is for horses?
It's quite similar. I would say that donkeys tend to be pretty good doers, even better than horses. So we're still looking for that low sugar, low starch. It's all generally the same with any hoofed animal, looking for low sugar, low starch. So, and donkeys tend to require less quality protein to horses as well. So you can get away with just a full TEF low sugar diet, but still wanting to meet their vitamin and mineral requirements. So for a donkey, it's quite similar with their vitamin and mineral requirements. So potentially all care might be a good option for them as well too. Yeah, so very similar.
Fantastic. All right, I've got a few questions from Holly Butler. She wanted to know a bit about TEF hay, whether it's full of sugar and how you actually calculate NCS on TEF hay.
Well, I can just sort of throw, it's not full of sugar. Of course, all hay is going to differ from time to time, but it's generally a lower sugar hay, somewhere in between the 8 and 12% as a general rule. Sometimes you might even get a bit lower, but you can then manage that further. It's not the greatest quality hay, but that's also what we're trying to do. We're trying to dull it down a little bit and just provide a fibre source. In terms of how do you calculate the NSC? Well, without getting a test, you really can't. But soaking it always gives you a little bit of an idea. If you've got something that after 15 minutes of soaking and there's plenty of black in the water of your soaking, then it's probably a pretty big indication that was quite high in sugar. But you can get testing done. There are methods to test hays. I did that for a customer recently just to test their the hay that they had in their shed. And pleasingly, it came up at about 4.6% sugar. So it was pretty safe. And it was off their own paddock. So yeah, that you can get it tested is the bottom line. You can also ask the providers as well, see if they can tell you.
Yeah, more and more people are doing that nowadays, or even creating a specific laminitis, low sugar, low hay, low sugar, low starch hay that they'll tell you what it's been tested at, and they test each batch too. So I think that's really cool that more people are doing that. But like always keep in mind that every batch of hay can differ. So just because you got it tested once doesn't mean it's always going to be the same. Everything changes with season, the time it was cut, whether it's lots of rain during that time of year or no rain, or lots of sun or no sun. So it can really vary. So be cautious.
There was another question there. Is teff hay soluble fibre or is it total fibre? I'm not sure that makes sense.
Not really sure exactly what you're trying to ask.
I've actually got Holly's email address. She's got quite a few questions, so we might take some of those questions offline. One that may be interested for everybody else is she was wondering whether copra is not recommended for laminitic prone horses due to the fat content.
That depends on if you need condition or not. So as Martin was saying before, might be a good idea for a poorer doer. So not all laminitic horses are big, chunky. Some of them are skinny and some of them are really struggling for weight, and that's really hard for an owner wondering what the heck they can feed them. So that's a really good source of calories, that fat, if you had a poorer doer. But yeah, if you had a good doer, we don't want to put any extra condition on them.
Sure.
I think that's a good point as well about the fat, and it's a good question, but it does come down to the stage of having to feed them something. And as I said, in some cases, what we don't want is as a horse which is struggling for condition. So we've got to look and say, well, what sources of energy can we provide to this horse? And we know that, you know, some soluble fibers, for example, can be handy, but we want to avoid sugar. We want to avoid starch. In some cases, we don't want to go over the top with protein because that'll be broken down into energy. And so fat itself can be just a more efficient source. We know there's not going to be sugar or starches in an oil as such. So sometimes it's a case of the lesser of a few evils when we do need condition on that horse.
You can always remember too that if your horse is founded on a higher sugar diet with a higher sugar pasture, sugar and starch is really good at keeping condition on the horse. So as soon as we take them away from that and give them that low sugar, really bland hay, some of them will drop weight. And then we need to rectify that. Not all of them. Some of them are really just always good doers, but some of them will. So we need to always monitor our horses and be armed with that knowledge of what we can do if that happens.
So Cassandra's got a question around short green grass. Is that typically full of sugar, or does it just sort of depend on the type of grass and maybe time of day?
Certainly depends on the type of grass, and as we alluded to, you know, those that are going to be higher in fructans, etc., your C3 grasses, again, the time of day, the later on in the day that it gets. But it's a really good point about the short grass, because there is a lot of people will fear, they look and they see the pasture up to the horse's flanks and they go, oh gosh, I can't put in there. In reality, that's got a lower sugar concentration. The other benefit of a longer pasture as opposed to short is, again, that exposure to the sun. So short pasture, one, if it's short, then it's stressed. Like drought pasture can be really high in sugar because it locks it up again and it says, I'm going to protect myself here. So that short pasture can be problematic, but it also, because of the sun coming down, it's going to hit all of those areas. Now, a longer pasture, it's like a canopy in the trees. You're going to get a protection of some of the shorter grass underneath if you've got some longer overhanging. So sometimes it's actually safer to have a horse grazing in a longer pasture, definitely, than something that's sparse. If it is sparse and it's short, you can guarantee it had plenty of exposure to the sun, and therefore the sugar content is going to be higher.
All right, so Jacinta wanted to know what, and I think you probably covered this, but what sort of things are good to feed a laminitic pony?
Well, similar to what we're saying, so generally making sure that we keep something that's very low starch. So if you have to feed it a hard feed, then again, if we're looking at something like a zero from a Hygain point of view, a product like that, which we know is low sugar, low starch, but provides some nutrition. That's going to be relatively safe for a pony. And then making sure, again, that the roughage, the forage around it, that the type of fiber that we provide to that horse is also low sugar and starch. So we've got to be accountable. In reality, we can give as much advice as possible, but eventually you've got to make sure, put all of your stuff that you're going to feed to that horse, put it all down and calculate what is the sugar and starch content. Is this stuff safe to give to my horse? Lupin hulls, yes, we know that's going to be safe. Beet pulp, unmolassed beet pulp, yeah, well, I know that's going to be pretty safe. It's no guarantee. But again, we're trying to work on what's the safest. So for a pony like that, and we're more than happy, people can obviously contact people like Holly and the rest of our nutrition team, and we can put together a diet. If you give us your examples there, we can definitely put together a diet for a pony like that.
Fantastic. Okay, so Debbie is asking in relation to the type of laminitis, if it is hormonal, to I guess, diagnose that it is a hormonal laminitis, do they need to be tested to verify that?
Yep. I would definitely speak to your vet about that. So I guess whenever we're dealing with laminitis as well, we always want to be reaching out to our vet if we're concerned, and then our farrier to work in conjunction with them. But things like Cushing's or EMS, you can get tests done. I would say they're not the cheapest, but that's really if you kind of want to get that solid answer. But at the end of the day, we're still going to manage them the same way, low sugar, low starch.
Fantastic. So this one might be out of our knowledge, but I'll ask it anyway. Jackie wanted to know, how do you go about fitting a muzzle? Is that our... that might be something that you could go into a horseland store and they might be able to help you. I do know that they do have some muzzles there. So I'd strongly suggest a horseland store would probably be able to help you with that one, Jackie.
Just make sure your horse can eat and drink.
Yeah.
And for anyone here who happens to be from a Saddle World store, I'm sure a Saddle World store can help you as well. We don't want to be picking one over the other. I'm sure any good saddlery store can help you in that regard.
Yeah,
but it can be a tough call.
Yeah. So Steph has asked, with oat and hay, is that a low NSC?
That's the opposite. Oat and hay will be very high. So oat and hay, as I say, it's generally a cooler area, and that will be, as I say, anywhere for the average of oat and hay. When you look at all of the tests done, around about 19 to 20% NSC, but you can be as high as 30. Some of that export hay can be really rich. I'd really avoid oat and hay. I really would. I'd avoid wheat and hay. Any of those cereals, it's best to avoid. And if you simply can't avoid it, please soak it. But yeah, avoid it.
Okay, Diana's asking in relation to WSC and starch, if feeding those together, what percentage in total would you stick to for laminitic horses?
I'd be looking at something under the 15%, as we're saying. If we're looking at total NSC, we want under 15%, ideally even less. As we saw from some of those graphs, something like zeros as low as 5.5% maximum. So that's even better to be looking. So the lower the better, but there are plenty of options now available under 15%. When I started in the business, wow, there was nothing. There was just nothing out there, but now a lot of companies, not just us, but a lot of companies have done some great work in this area and are providing some really good options underneath 15%.
All right, so I've got a question here. How long can we store hay? If somebody's got hay that's undercover and it's from 2 seasons ago, would it still be quite high in sugar if it was initially a high sugar hay? Does it change over years?
Yeah, no, it doesn't really. Once you get to a certain moisture content of hay, it isn't just sun, the moisture as well. So basically the hay itself will again protect I guess, and lock it all up and go into a state of rigor mortis, if you like, once the moisture content goes under a certain level. Now, if the moisture content stays above 8%, 10%, it's going to go moldy. So your 2 years, it's going to be pretty ordinary. I don't want to walk into that barn if it's gone moldy. So that's going to be bad. If it's under that level, then the sugar will stay. So actually shedding the hay for a certain period of time, for a year or whatever, isn't necessarily going to take it out, because it's going to stick in there because it's no longer respirating because the moisture isn't there.
Okay, so I got one from Linda here. She's been recommended that microbeat is good for putting weight on without sugar. What are our thoughts and recommendations in terms of feeding microbeat to a laminitic pony?
Great option.
Okay.
If she wants specific help, if anyone here wants specific help to actually formulate a diet, you can contact us anytime, and we will ask you, I'll ask you a lot of questions about your horse and what's happening with their situation.